Everyone, welcome to another Headliners Book Club event. We're very fortunate this evening to have Dr. Jody Ferguson as our author and featured speaker. Jody Ferguson is a fifth-generation Texan who has amassed 20 plus years of experience in political military affairs, most recently working in the Pentagon for 4 years, where he served as a senior advisor in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. For his services, he was awarded the Department of Defense Medal for Exceptional Public Service in 2013. During this time, he traveled often to Russia and East Asia as a policy analyst and a defense contractor based out of Washington, D.C. area. Dr. Ferguson has a PhD in international relations from the Johns Hopkins University with a focus on Northeast Asian security affairs. His postdoctoral work at Princeton University included authoring and co-editing 3 books on the foreign policies and strategic thought of Japan and Russia in Northeast Asia. He speaks French, Japanese, Russian, of course, English, and has developed a keen insight into East Asia and Russia. In 2015, he gave up his career in international affairs and resettled in Austin with his wife and 3 children to follow a passion for writing. Although he has been published numerous times in the political and academic press, he plans to focus exclusively on writing fiction. He plans on writing several novels, which will be loosely based on family members, so that one day his children and their children will have a record of their predecessors. And we'll ask you more about that a little later. Okay, you're on.
Thanks so much for having me, Rose Betty. And thanks to everyone that tuned in tonight. I hope everyone's recovered from Snowmageddon. It's good to kind of have life back to normal somewhat. I started writing this book quite a while ago in bits and spurts. But it was I was somewhat fortuitous in the timing of the publication of the book, because it turns out it was published on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, 2020, September 2020. And in fact, my publication date, September 19th, 2020, was the 75th anniversary of the date of the first page of this book, when the book opens and the protagonist, Harry, is there in Shanghai to accept the Japanese surrender. As I set out to write the book, I wanted to salute that generation that won the war, won the peace afterwards. But I was quite lucky, and it was very serendipitous that it just turns out that it happened the 75th anniversary of the end of the war. So when I began writing the book, as Rose Betty mentioned in the introduction, I've been fortunate. I've lived all over, and I've lived and spent a great deal of time in East Asia. And Shanghai was a city I visited early on in my stay overseas. And at the time, it was still very much an Art Deco city. Western buildings that line the Bund that I describe in my novel. Today, if you go to Shanghai, it's filled with skyscrapers. It's like Manhattan or Hong Kong. The old buildings still remain, but they don't stand out the way they did when I first visited in the early 90s. And when I set out to write a novel, I wanted to bring in a lot of different themes, but a long time ago, even before I put pen to paper, I thought Shanghai would be a great setting for a story that takes place pre-World War II. And so that's how I ended up writing about Shanghai. Now I mentioned the major themes. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to read the book, and I don't want to be a spoiler in any way, but there are certain major themes that I wanted to address in the book, themes that are universal, themes that we all grapple with as individuals, and that people always have dealt with throughout history. To make it in that sense a timeless story, even though it's very much set and it's a product of World War II, but I still wanted to reach out to all types of readers and all types of generations. So the themes, I have about 7 or 8 themes that weave throughout the book. A major one, of course, is family. Harry comes, he's an orphan, but he's raised by an uncle and an aunt that are quite different in the way they relate to him. But he's lucky in the sense that he's been raised by an uncle and an aunt that took him in during the Depression. But still, families, no matter how close knit, all have their issues and their difficulties, and it makes sense that our most difficult, our most complicated relationships are those relationships within our families. And I tried very much to address that throughout the book, and that theme plays out. Harry, who's very much hesitant about being close to his family because of his own history, and slowly being brought to the realization that, close family ties are very, very important. And he sees that in the people he interacts with. Another major theme that I touch on in the book is religion. Something that the main character, and the other characters in the book grapple with during such a tumultuous time when the world is at war, people are dying, they're suffering, and you see Harry throughout the book grappling with this question, the eternal question of religion, of God, of Jesus, of suffering, of forgiveness, and a book that he very much loves, that his grandmother had introduced him to, is Pilgrim's Progress, and he quotes the book throughout the novel, and he introduces people to the book that haven't read it, and it's part of his own journey in grappling with these issues, and so religion was also a central pillar of the book that I wanted to bring forth. And another theme that goes back to originally what I mentioned, how I wish to salute the generation that survived the Depression and World War II, is I wanted to talk about, in the book, I wanted to show and talk about how people behave under duress. People put in certain situations react very, very differently. We may think that we know how we would react to certain things at certain times, but until we are put in those trying circumstances, we really don't know how we would react. There was a very, very good book that I read that if you go on my website, jodyferguson.com, I do all sorts of book reviews. There's one called Priscilla, The Adventures of an English Woman in Occupied France. And it's about an English author in the 1980s or 90s named Nicholas Shakespeare, who finds all of the old letters and photos and diaries of his aunt, who, after she died, it was an aunt who had been very, very mysterious, and they only knew that she was in occupied France. The rumor was that she had fought for the resistance against the Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. But he finds a very, very different woman when he reads these letters. And it's because she was in circumstances that none of us could really ever imagine having to be under. And we find that with Victoria as well. She has to make compromises. She does things that are horrible, distasteful, perhaps in other people's eyes, but she does them simply to survive. And the same with Harry in uniform. He faces things on a daily basis that people can never really ever imagine. So I really wanted to understand how people, and in fact, there's a quote in the beginning of my book. I give 2 quotes. And one of them is a quote by Thomas Hardy. And essentially, Thomas Hardy says that when a person goes through a horrible ordeal, there are going to be one of 2 outcomes. Either that tragedy or ordeal will be that person's downfall, or it will build them and become the basis of their sublimity. And I kind of wanted to show how Harry, hardscrabble, orphan from a hardscrabble town in Pennsylvania, rose up above his circumstances, his surroundings, to become a better person. Another theme I talk about, obviously, is love and perseverance, how we love someone unceasingly, unconditionally, through time, through distance, through tragedy, through heartbreak. But we continue to love, and we continue to persevere in that love. Another theme I talk about is the dehumanization of war that's laced throughout the book. Soldiers, when they're in combat, the enemy is dehumanized in their eyes. That's how commanders, leaders try and force soldiers of lower ranks to do what they do on a daily basis. They dehumanize the enemy, and it's eternal throughout warfare. And in America is no different. From Krauts to Japs to Gooks to Dinks to Hajis, we've always, throughout war, you try and dehumanize the enemy, and it makes killing them less, a little more palatable, perhaps. I wanted to show that Harry was different because Harry had lived in Japan. In this book, he was a correspondent there. He knew Japanese people. He had Japanese friends, and he sees people on the other side, and you'll see that when he comes upon Japanese corpses, he feels bad for them. He thinks about their families and about how they'll never hear from them again, and they'll never know what happened to them. And it's interesting. A lot of the material for this book I took from various people that I knew that survived the war, fought in the war. But the incident at the end where there's a group of Japanese schoolgirls that are caught up in the battle in Okinawa, and I won't go into the details, but it's just a horrible scene. Well, when I was traveling in Okinawa in 1991, I think it was, I actually met survivors of this group of schoolgirls who were leading tours of these caves where this incident happened. And I spoke to them in Japanese and was able to stand and walk around with one woman for about a half hour and ask her all sorts of questions about what happened. And so the scene where Harry's reacting and the other Marines are reacting afterwards is literally taken from dialogue I had with these women. It was very, very fascinating. And there are other historical themes that I wanted to bring into it. The theme of the White Russians, that aspect of history is lost to a lot of people. They hear White Russians and they're, well, what do you mean all Russians are white, aren't they? Well, no, it's a political term. Red versus white, meaning communist versus non-communist or imperialist, if you will. But there were large numbers of White Russians that fled Russia during the Civil Revolution and subsequent Civil War, which essentially went from 1917 to 1921 or even 23. And we hear, and if you go and look at Hollywood movies of the 40s and 50s, you see, in Casablanca, the White Russians, most of them fled through Europe, especially the well-off. Well, the not so well-off ended up leaving Russia through Siberia and into China. And hundreds of thousands of them lived in China, some of them in Japan, in between the First and Second World War, stateless, at the mercy of whatever the local government was. And I wanted to elucidate that aspect of history as well. Given my own connection with Russia, my wife is Russian, my children are half Russian, and I wanted to elucidate that. And one more theme, one last theme that I really wanted to bring up in this novel was I wanted to have a very strong female character. And I wanted to bring out Victoria as a woman who's in the beginning perhaps shy, young, inexperienced, how she survives the war and becomes really the pillar for a large extended family that she's living with and becomes the leader of the family, and how the war transformed her. She had to make unpalatable decisions and choices, but the war transformed her into a stronger person. You know, throughout the book, I make all sorts of literary, cinematic references. As I mentioned, my own experiences as well, neighbors' experiences. One of the characters, Swede, was drawn from one of our neighbors growing up here in Austin, was a Texan who fought in the war, fought in the Pacific. And I met him before he died and heard all sorts of stories and went through his photos and of his time in the Pacific. I make a reference to Tom Lee, who's a great Texas artist. Make references to baseball. I love baseball and I love the history of baseball. Texas football, fishing, hunting. So there are all sorts of references that are based on my own personal experiences and cinematic references and literary references and Shakespeare and Kipling and of course Wilfred Owen and most of all though Pilgrim's Progress. But I'm gonna leave it at there. I've spoken for about 15 minutes. I think that's enough. I don't need to really go into more. I'm happy to answer your questions. And again, thanks for listening in.
Jody, would you show the maps and give us some idea about the?
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so in
the importance of Shanghai.
In the book, of course, there are all sorts of references to Shanghai and the international community in Shanghai, which was quite large. And in fact, all up and down the Chinese seaboard, in every major Chinese city along the Yangtze, there were these settlements that were peopled and policed and governed by only European, American, or Japanese citizens, where the Chinese could come in and do what they pleased, or rather they could come in and work and whatever, but these settlements were run. McKinnon, actually, why don't we I've got a minute-long video that explains a little bit about the international settlements in China. Go ahead.
Okay, here it goes.
Concessions in China in the late 19th century and early 20th century refer to British, French, American, even Russian, Japanese, of course, as well, economic zones, which were free of Chinese law, free of Chinese taxes. And in these concessions lived large numbers of Western business people, their families. And with that, brought Western and Japanese troops in to guard these concessions. They had their own schools, they went to their own churches, they had Art Deco hotels, they had banks, they had their own police forces, and they were immune to Chinese law, even outside of those concessions. Over the decades, these concessions grew and grew, and by the outbreak of World War II, there were several 100,000 Westerners, missionaries, business people, troops living in China. After the Marco Polo incident, Chiang Kai-shek pulled his forces southward. He understood that if he could pull the Japanese down, perhaps create some sort of conflict with Western assets, with Western nationals, that the West could be brought into the war on the side of the Chinese.
Yeah, and McKinnon, thanks. Let's go again. Now I'm going to show you a really cool graphic map, the Shanghai map, that kind of gives you an idea of the cityscape. Yeah, so as you can see in there, that you have the French settlement there, you have the international settlement. This is actually the view looking north. If you see the river, the Huangpu River, which is a tributary of the Yangtze, about 20 miles north of the city, it flew into the mouth of the Yangtze River. So Shanghai was very, very strategically vital part of China, and which is why the British controlled it economically. The Japanese wanted to control it militarily. And anyway, yeah, so this is, I thought this was a really nice map that kind of shows, like I said, these areas, you know, in the people that lived within them, they were completely immune to any Chinese laws or anything. They could go out and do anything, and they could only be tried by Western judges and courts within Shanghai. Yeah, thanks. So I'm ready to take questions.
Jody, can you put the, McKinnon, put the map back up for just a second? You had mentioned a movie called Empire of the Sun, which really I've now watched twice. And your description of the Bund and the, is it called the Hotel Cathay or Cathay Hotel?
Yes.
Where was the British concession? Where was the French? I mean, I can't really read it that clearly on here.
Okay, let me maybe, yeah, okay, who's controlling the cursor? Is that McKenna?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that area, it says Central, and then to the right of that, it says International Settlement.
Okay.
That was largely the British concession, and then if you go further to the right, you'll see Settlement Extension.
Okay.
That was more British. And if you go scroll back to the river where it says the Bund, go down towards okay, back near where the Central is. Essentially the Cathay Hotel, you see that word, it says the Bund along the river, that road. Yeah, that's where the Cathay Hotel was. That's where all the major, and still are all the major Art Deco buildings that are architectural masterpieces. They're wonderful, wonderful buildings to see. Unfortunately, now the entire area is surrounded by massive skyscrapers, but it's really, really nice. And above or south of it, but above it in this photo is the French settlement there. And then if you go below the international settlement where it says Northern Chape and Northern, yeah, that originally was the American concession, but basically it became the Japanese concession. And as you see at the very, very bottom, there's even a Japanese school, it says down near the settlement boundary, right? And within these concessions combined probably were all told 100,000 Westerners, maybe 50,000 Japanese. And in those 100,000 Westerners were probably 30 or 40,000 Russians who were living there because it was really the only safe place for them to live.
There's a couple of questions from Shelley. When was Shanghai first settled by Europeans, and who were there and why?
It was a fishing village until 1849. It was teeny. It meant nothing in the original, in Chinese history, the name never ever appeared. It was prior to, the Qing dynasty and before that. It was a fishing village. The British won the Opium War, and they demanded territorial concessions along the Chinese coast and in the Yangtze River valleys. And one of the sites they picked was Shanghai. So actually, it was Shanghai today as a creation. It wouldn't exist were it not for the British. So it was developed roughly around the time that Hong Kong was, around 1849. And throughout the history of the British Empire, the two vied for control of the being the financial centers of East Asia. The British really wanted Hong Kong to be the financial center of East Asia, but most of the traders, whether they be British, French, American, Shanghai was where they did most of their business because it was at the confluence of the Yangtze River where it hit the East China Sea. So it was a much better location for trading than Hong Kong was. And the Peace Hotel, Jeff, you asked about the Peace Hotel. Yes, that's the Cathay.
Okay.
And they have that famous jazz band. I don't know if it was playing when you were there. They're famous for it, the Peace Hotel Jazz Band. I see another question about the Empire of the Sun. Yes, wonderful movie. The book's even better. It's a true story. It was written by a British author named James G. Ballard, and he is the boy Jamie in the movie, who incidentally was played by Christian Bale, who's still a very famous actor. Very rare when child actors continue their career up to adulthood and remain famous. But that was his first movie. I thought the movie was well done. It was done by Steven Spielberg. The book's quite different. But that actually was that movie was the reason why I wanted to go see Shanghai. I saw it when I was in college. My first job out of college was in Japan. When I was living in Japan, I said, I'm going to go see Shanghai. I got to go see this town, see these buildings, these Western architectural gems right there on the banks of a Chinese river. So yeah, I recommend the book. I recommend the movie. Yeah.
In the movie, it seemed that the Japanese came and pilfered. I mean, they took everything out of the British homes in the British concession and put it someplace where it just looked like a huge antique mall. I mean, what was the purpose of that? Were they going to redistribute?
They put it in a stadium, a soccer stadium on the outskirts of Shanghai. And that's true. And that was portrayed in the movie. And it's in the book. They talk about it. They moved, and I guess, they were going to redistribute it, take it back to Japan, whatever. But they took Bentleys, Rolls Royces, paintings, sculptures, anything of value, that was large, unlike, say, jewelry or gold coins or cash they could just take and put in a bank or keep it on their person. But yeah, that did happen. They pilfered all the homes. And interestingly enough, at the end of the war, all of the British and everyone just went back. Their homes were given back to them, and they went right back. The French, anyone that had a home there was given the freedom to go back and do it. But at that point, the extraterritorial settlement that they had agreed to with the Chinese government was over. They no longer were, immune from Chinese law. They went back to try and start their businesses and live as they had before the war, but it had changed by then. And 4 years later, they were, of course, driven out by the communists.
We have several questions. I'm going to call on you to ask the questions. That might be a good idea. We have one from Walter Ferguson. Why don't you ask the question about the settlements, the concessions?
Are there any remnants of the foreign settlements in Shanghai? Only the buildings, Scott. There are no more ancestors. Most of the Westerners, of course, fled. And interestingly, most of the Russians that were living there, the tens and thousands of Russians that were stuck in China, they were given the freedom to emigrate either to Canada, United States, or Australia. And I would say they probably one third went to those three places. Some of them that decided to go back to the Soviet Union, Russia under Stalin unleashed a propaganda campaign to tell them, oh, you come back to the motherland, you're welcome. Those that went back were put in gulags or were killed.
Jim Williams, you had a question?
Yes, it reads, the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China occurred in Shanghai at the Jingjiang Hotel. I visited there in the early 80s. I returned only a couple of years ago. A comment. Yeah, that is right. It did. It happened there. And Shanghai is a very interesting city. It's young. I mean, it's as young as Austin. Scott and my great-great-grandfather came to Austin in 1849, and that was the year Shanghai was founded. But now it's a city of 24 million, I think. It's great food, interesting place to go visit. And the gem of it, though, is really the architectural treasures left behind by those Western settlements. And in fact, Scott asked, when was it first settled and who was there and why? It wasn't just the British that were there. The French had a concession there, the Americans, the Japanese went in, and again, the Russians ended up there because of the Russian Civil War. But there were Portuguese there. There were large numbers of Westerners that immigrated there after World War I, particularly from Eastern Europe. A lot of Jewish families immigrated there in the early years of Hitler because that was the one place they could go, and they didn't need a passport or a visa. They could just show up. They couldn't go to Palestine. They couldn't go to North America without a visa, but they could go to Shanghai and live there. So it's very, very interesting history.
Wow. Tell us about Above the Water, what the title means. And also you have at the start of every chapter, there's a symbol. If any of you have your book, you can look at the beginning of every chapter.
That's a great question. And I neglected to point that out, so I'm glad you did. Above the Water is a play on words for the characters for Shanghai, which are at the beginning of each chapter. As you can see here, Shanghai. And what that means, Shanghai, the characters literally mean above the sea. And it's the place where Shanghai sits, above the confluence of the Yangtze, mouth of the Yangtze River going out to the sea. It's also it's a reference in my book to, as I said, people enduring, surviving wartime, doing what they need to do to stay above the water. And that's, you know, a theme that I continually refer to. You know, Harry often has dreams and he's drowning, right? And it's just life overwhelming him with everything that's being thrown in his face from an early age, being orphaned, growing up and feeling a stranger in his own house, going off to war, falling in love with a woman that he's separated from for many years, and witnessing everything that he had. He's just trying to breathe. He's just trying to survive. And I mentioned there's, you know, cinematic references throughout my book. One of my favorite all-time movies is a movie. It's a true story, and the movie's called Breaker Morant. It's an Australian film from the early 80s, but it's a story about 3 Australian soldiers in the Boer War in South Africa that are basically made scapegoats. They're put on trial for murder by the British for having murdered Boer prisoners. And the British don't want to try any Brits from England. They just want to kind of find these convenient fall guys to show to the South Africans and to the Germans who were behind the South Africans that, you know, we want to end this war. We don't want any atrocities to happen. And they try these 3 Australians for murder. But their lawyer makes a very, very passionate defense of them. And he reads, there's a quote that he makes in the movie about what people go through in wartime. And I want to read the quote to you. It's not in the book, but I wanted to read it anyway. But as he's defending these 3 Australians in front of a British court-martial, he says, quote, "The barbarities of war are seldom committed by abnormal men. The tragedy of war is that these horrors are committed by normal men in abnormal situations, situations in which the ebb and flow of everyday life have departed and have been replaced by a constant round of fear and anger, blood and death." Those are the kind of situations that I talked about, that I wanted to portray in this book, how people react to them. People react differently. You know, a lot of us say, oh, you know, if I had been in occupied Holland in World War II, yeah, absolutely, I would have sheltered Jewish families in my attic, or I would have done this to reach out. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know. I mean, if we had our own families, our priorities would probably be our own families. And if we were going to, sheltering Jewish families would have put our own families at risk to death, I venture to guess that most people wouldn't take them in. So people react differently. And I wanted to kind of explore how Victoria reacts. She realizes what she has to do to save her family. And it's not pretty, the choices she's confronted with and the choices she makes, but people do what they have to do to survive. And it's not pretty always.
Sure. There were so many fabulous quotes. You talk about references to literature, Shakespeare and Hardy, and the constant reference back to Pilgrim's Progress. I found that really fascinating, the Celestial City. Now, were you a student of Bunyan? You must have been.
Well, I read him. Obviously, I read the book, but
clearly many times.
Again, you know where I found my first exposure to Bunyan was that same movie I just quoted, Breaker Morant. The lieutenant who is under trial, one of the lieutenants, he talks about how his family on Sundays would gather around the table outside for a Sunday lunch, and his father would read quotes from Pilgrim's Progress.
Amazing.
So,
the book starts off with the smell of Shanghai, and it ends really with the the smell of Shanghai. Is it truly that distinctive from the Yangtze?
That's from my own experience. My first reaction when I landed, first time I went to a major city in Asia right out of college, my first job was in Tokyo. Or actually, it wasn't in Tokyo, but I landed in Tokyo, emerged from the airport, and was hit with this smell. Now, not a bad smell, but just a different. And you realize, you know, in a very Proustian way, you know, as Marcel Proust would appreciate, your senses, you realize how different it is through your senses, through your smell, through the touch, the feel, the taste, everything. So I wanted to convey that as well, my own personal experience of traveling to Asia. And, you know, it's, I suppose, Jeff, you know, Connor would probably, you'd say the same about the first time you travel to Egypt and you emerge in Cairo and it's, wow, this is so different. And the smell is one of the things. It may be a bad smell. It may be not a bad smell, but it's distinctive smell nevertheless. And yeah, I wanted to pay tribute to Marcel Proust, I guess, with, and myself, my own experiences with that opening and closing of his being reminded by the smell.
There was a quote in there somewhere in the late, somewhere like 280, somewhere in there, where you talk about a normal man can't be expected to go through more than 240 days of combat. I mean, I would think he would not be able to go through more than 100 days before he's inured to all the suffering and the violence and I mean, you talk about the dehumanization of war. Normal men found themselves doing just dreadful things. That whole incident in the cave was just frightening, terrifying, horrifying.
Yeah, that was somehow an arbitrary figure that the U.S. military came up with during World War II. That, you know, though there may be breaks in combat or you may be sent back for certain days, your cumulative of 240 days, they did not want to go over that. And of course, many men did. But, you know, people can suffer from PTSD after one incident of 5 minutes. So, but you can imagine these guys, you know, especially the Marines on these islands. Once they landed on that island, the only way they got off was to take the island, get wounded, or get killed. And in the case of Peleliu, they thought they were going to clear the island in 3 days, but it turned out to be almost 3 months. And some of the men were there from the beginning to the end. And yeah, it just must have been something that I would never want myself or anybody to imagine to have to go through.
When Jeff was talking about the Temple of Crocodiles, I couldn't help but recall the scene in the book where the corpses, the Japanese corpses, are in the water and crocodiles came to eat them, to dispose of them.
And that happened on Guadalcanal, and they named it Alligator Creek, even though there weren't no alligators. It was crocodiles. Yeah, they still named it Alligator Creek.
Wow, amazing. The British they're all concessions. The settlements, was concession and a translation of the Chinese or the Japanese, or is that the name the British gave?
No, that was the name that the British gave to their own concession. It was conceded to them by the Chinese, essentially.
I see. That's how it's
what the reference was. Yeah.
Okay.
And they called it the international settlement in the case of the British settlements, and normally the French they would call the French concession. And it was not just Shanghai, but there were every major city had it. Beijing had one. You go all up and down the Yangtze River. And I mentioned this in one of my earlier talks at the Headliners about the beginning of World War II. But if you can imagine the United States were Los Angeles, Seattle, San Francisco, New Orleans, New York, Washington, D.C., Miami, Florida, and then along the Mississippi River, say Memphis, St. Louis, Louisville, were they all to have foreign settlements that were policed only by foreign policemen with presence of foreign troops? You can really imagine why the Chinese refer to that period of 1840 to World War II as a century of humiliation. They were powerless to do anything. And if you can imagine the United States with that, I don't know how Americans would be able to deal with that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was a very interesting time, needless to say.
Yeah. Another reference you make, a literary reference, was Rudyard Kipling, God help us, for we knew the worst too young, about all these young kids going to war and what they encounter and what they sign up for and didn't know what they were getting into. And it's life-changing.
Yeah, there was an incident in the when he's going off in the very, very beginning from Norfolk. They get on the boat that takes them to New Zealand. They go through the Panama Canal. And Harry, he's lived in Shanghai as a war correspondent, and he's seen the suffering that's going on around the world, particularly in Asia, where they're getting ready to go fight. And all around him, these young kids, 18, 19 years old, for them, it's a big adventure. They have no idea what is laying ahead of them. They're not thinking about dying. All they're thinking about is getting medals and seeing the world and having a great time. Harry, and I mentioned this in the book, he's thinking about death. He's seen it, and he knows there's a very good possibility he's never going to come back. And he is very, very somber going. But for most of these guys going overseas for the first time ever, it was a great adventure. It's a great adventure.
It's really something else for sure. Tough stuff that they encountered when they got over there. So, awakening. I think when you were talking about at the very beginning of the book, and my Latin is not particularly good, iacta alia est, the die is cast. I thought that was a very significant way to launch into the plot of the book.
Yeah. Shakespeare again.
Right.
Because we don't really know if Caesar said that, but I think Shakespeare said he said it, or maybe Caesar did say it. No, you know what? It was in his, I think he wrote it in his book. Caesar wrote it in his books. Maybe it was even the Gallic Wars that he wrote it, referring to his time in Italy. The die is cast.
When the book starts, Harry has a souvenir that he gives to his nephew, and it's a Mexican silver dollar. Maybe you can explain why Mexican silver was the currency used by traders in China.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. That's a very interesting one of these little anecdotes of history that I find so fascinating. Like, for example, in the White Russian communities in China, how did they end up there? Another really, really interesting thing is that in China, up until World War II, really the most stable form of currency that people used were Mexican silver dollars. And it was not just in China, but in Southeast Asia as well. And I read about this when I was taking a class in Chinese history, I think back in grad school or something. But essentially, here's how it happened. Mexico obviously was Spanish colony until 1821 or 24, I can't remember, 21 or 24. And Philippines was a Spanish colony until 1898, Spanish-American War, when we took it from them. But there was a very big silver trade going on between Spain, Mexico, and the Philippines. I mean, that was the route that goods moved across the Spanish Empire, were through Mexico and to the Philippines and back. And for whatever reason, in the mid-19th century, the Mexican silver dollar became the most trusted form of currency and trade, thanks to that Spanish trade route. And it somehow caught on to China as well. And in fact, Mao Zedong paid the troops of the Red Army, the Chinese Red Army during the Civil War. They were paid by Mexican silver dollar. They carried around chests of Mexican silver dollars to pay their soldiers. Because at that time, the Chinese paper currency was absolutely worthless. So, yeah, it's an interesting, and again, that's something that I wanted to bring out in this book, all these different anecdotes of history that I found when I was living in Russia and East Asia. My next novel that I'm writing right now is much more based on a particular family member. But I wanted to have a novel to play with where I could throw in all these historical anecdotes that I think are really so fun. Something that one reason I enjoy reading history so much.
When you grounded with a lot of theater, a lot of literature, but also people who we know, whether they're in Hollywood, Betty Grable or who is the band leader who was dating
Harry James.
Yeah, and they're
Bob Hope.
Yeah. And then you also talk about the Avalon in Houston as a place to go for hamburgers. You talk about Clark Field with the sports, and then even I think the Japanese friend of Harry's went to the University of Michigan, so he wanted to see he wanted to see the football games in the morning that were.
You listen to him on the radio, Armed Forces Network,
or radio. Okay,
yeah.
I thought that was kind of interesting. And I have, I suppose, two more questions. Do you think that Camp Mayberry, I can't even say it, Camp Mayberry's Museum of the Pacific is a good place to see the photographs and slides and history of what took place in the Pacific Theater?
It's a great museum. Now, it's not dedicated simply to the Pacific War. It's actually dedicated to, now the one in Fredericksburg, Nimitz is, and that is great. Go see that if you haven't and get a good meal while you're there, but not the museum, but in Fredericksburg. But the one at Camp Mayberry, I took my son there for a field trip. He had to do research. It was great. It is dedicated to soldiers of the Texas Guard all through history. So it goes all the way from essentially the Civil War up through the Gulf War. And the World War II section is very, very good. And there's a little small, and it's got a lot of great photos and memorabilia and pieces of equipment. And there's a great little part in there that refers to Captain Wascow, who was a kid from, Henry Wascow was a kid from Belton that was killed in Italy in World War II, who became famous throughout America because Ernie Pyle, who was the most famous columnist in the field during World War II with American soldiers, wrote one of his columns about Henry Wascow, what a great leader he was. And you look it up, it's the death of Captain Wascow. You can Google it, WSKOW. And it is considered some of the best short writing about men in wartime and about leadership in wartime. And Tom Hanks read this column out loud at the dedication of the World War II monument in Washington, D.C. about 10, 15 years ago when they opened it.
It seems to me the last time I was there, I saw some at Camp Mayberry. There was a series of photos showing the tropical ulcers, which you reference in the book, how it's the scourge of the soldiers over in the tropics, and many more men died from those ulcers that got infected and whatnot, not just from being shot or mowed down by machine guns. Is that true that there was a great many people who, or even a great many more people? It seemed that way.
Sure. Well, sure. World War II, although World War II actually was the first war where deaths in combat outnumbered deaths, interestingly enough, by disease and exposure of any other American war. Well, maybe the Civil War was different, but prior to World War II, Spanish-American War is a great example. We didn't lose a lot, but I think over 80% of the men we lost were from disease or bad food, botulism, which Upton Sinclair later exposed in his book, The Jungle. World War I as well, we had a lot of men that were lost to the flu, Spanish flu. But yeah, in World War II, certainly we had men died of malaria. As I mentioned on Cape Gloucester, a lot of Marines were lost from falling trees, snake bites, things like that. It was, the Pacific Theater in particular was, even though we had more soldiers that died in the European theater in World War II, that was mainly a number of sheer, it was a factor of sheer numbers. We just had more combat infantrymen deployed in Europe. We had far fewer deployed in the Pacific. But the theater they were in the Pacific, they were on these islands, malaria, these jungle lesions, these jungle sores, bad drinking water. It was, I mean, you know, war is hell. That's the big cliche. But, you know, men on the front line in Europe could get pulled back to go rest in Paris in some cases, or in London, or wherever, just in downtime. Men in the Pacific, once they got off those islands, they were just pulled back to different islands. They were populated by men. And so that's why I thought that I wanted to throw in, and again, this is a true story, the Bob Hope show that was put up on that island of Pavuvu. And Harry makes a comment at one point later on that as he's going under the gas in an operation, he muses to himself that this nurse that he sees in the background is the first nurse he'd seen in almost a year, besides Patty Thomas, who was a Hollywood actress, in the Bob Hope show on Pavuvu Island. Bob Hope did go to Pavuvu, and he did perform with Patty Thomas.
Great story. Can you talk about Pidgin English, what it is, since you have Harry speaking it in the beginning? What is Pidgin English?
It's a language that developed around the Pacific in the 19th century. That it's a corruption, the Chinese corruption of the word business, which they could pronounce, and it became out as pidgin. But it was spoken all over the Pacific, and it was spoken in Hawaii before it was a U.S. state, among Western traders and the Hawaiian Islanders, and it was spoken in China and in Japan. Wherever Western traders were operating in Asia, they developed this pidgin language, is what it was called. And there are some hilarious books and jokes all about Westerners in China in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, how they're getting by with pidgin, and I've cracked up reading. I included more of it in early versions of the book, but one of my editors encouraged me to take them out because she thought it was too confusing.
There are a couple of comments and questions, and I'm just going to call on you to ask them. Jeff, you had a comment about the book reminding you of something you read in graduate school. Can you speak to that? Jeff Connor,
okay,
can you?
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Jody, I was saying, I remember in graduate school reading a book called Shanghai Splendor, but I can't remember now the author, but it's a social history of Shanghai in the pre-World War II era, and what a fashionable place it was, and how people made it a point to go there. It was a to-go place, not just a business place. And then I remembered when I was reading your book, the opening scene of one of the Indiana Jones movies, which I haven't taken time to look up, but remember it's
the second one. Yeah.
It's the second one. But again, showing it as such a glamorous place as it was pre-World War. And so it just makes it all the more dramatic in your book, showing the downfall from this international place to go to people desperate for survival or not surviving during the war. And it really, I've thought about that a lot as I was reading your book.
Yeah, that's I've seen that book too, and it was not only a place that you had to, it had, you know, for among Westerner celebrities, Charlie Chaplin, all sorts of movie stars went there, singers, painters, but for Chinese as well and Japanese. I mean, that was the beginning of the Chinese film industry. They've made some wonderful films in China over the years, even under communism. Wonderful movies. That was the original location of the Chinese film industry. There's also a great movie made in the 1930s called Shanghai Express. It was done by a German director, but it starred Marlene Dietrich and Anna May Wong, who was one of the first famous Chinese American actresses. but again, so even for Chinese, it was a glamorous place to go, be seen, go to nightclubs, see music. But its fall was dramatic. Yeah, I mean, you know, the Japanese marched in, and that was the end of Shanghai as we knew it. And you know, Chairman Mao said the greatest thing that ever happened for the Communist Party of China was having the Japanese invade us, because it just tore Chinese society down and left a clean slate for the Chinese Communist Party to come in and remake the country.
Was the cafe occupied by the Japanese as a military headquarters during 1941?
Rest and Recreation Center.
Oh, Rest and Recreation. Okay.
For officers, yeah. They took over the American Club. They took over the British Shanghai Club as well. Yeah, they took over a lot of different buildings and made them part of the Japanese military, you know, establishment essentially.
And was the Hamilton House where Harry lived, his apartment, was that an actual building where they had all foreigners?
Yes, it was.
To wear armbands to identify themselves? Yeah.
And that's where a lot of young Western bachelors lived before the war, like Harry.
Interesting. I think there's another comment. Is it Scott Ferguson, maybe? Do you want to make a comment about that?
Yeah, just asking you that film making, I've heard, is filming 100 hours and editing it down to 2 to tell the story they want to tell. How is writing a novel? Is it similar?
Yeah, in my case, it was. This is my first novel, so, you know, I imagine it's different for some people. But in my case, I had a much larger book. In fact, I had my original draft had Harry in Tokyo as well. I spent a portion of the book talking about his time in Tokyo. For me, writing, whether it's a school report, an article, or in this case, a book, for me, writing big, large volume, and then whittling down is much easier than writing and hoping it's just going to fit the bill right there.
You think fiction's harder to write than nonfiction?
They're different. I think it's funner to write. So in that respect, it's not harder. But, you know, I've published a few books, political science books, and, you know, you have a boilerplate. You know what is expected, and you outline it. I didn't really outline this book. I just started writing it, and it just kind of came to me. And same with the book that I'm writing right now. I just kind of sat down and I thought about how would I open it? Well, I'm going to make a quote that's going to talk about 2 people, and you're going to get an idea of these 2 main characters through this quote from a third person, and just go from there. And that happened with this book. I just kind of started writing it, and it flowed that way. And other writers that I've spoken with, they largely say the same thing, that it just kind of comes.
The ending of this book is that, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. The ending?
The ending of this book, is that the ending you had planned? Or did you have something else in mind? Or how did that morph?
Well, I had 2 editors that begged me to let Victoria, well, I don't want to do a spoiler alert. I had pretty much, this is the ending that I had from original. I was urged to change it, but I won't tell you how for those that haven't read the book, but I didn't change it.
All right. So would you say this is an historical novel with a love story, or a romance novel with an historical backdrop?
I guess it started out, I wrote it, I wanted to talk about, you know, history, and bring in and make it, you know, make it more universal or reachable to an audience with romance. But initially, Victoria was never a voice in the book. She had no role in the narration of the book. One of the editors said, you need to bring her in. And I was hesitant because I was like, can I write from the viewpoint of a woman? That's going to be a big challenge. But I looked at it as a challenge. Hey, if you're going to be a writer, try it. So I did. And two of my editors were women, and, you know, passed their muster, I guess. But she became much more an integral part of the book with subsequent drafts. So in that case, yes, it's a romance, a Dr. Zhivago type of romance that, you know, just happens to be in a World War II historical setting.
Okay. Well, I have to say, we've taken so much of your time. Are there additional questions? There is one question I have. Tell us about your next book so we can anticipate it and look forward to it, and then we'll close the evening.
It's going to be loosely based on a great grandfather. He's the namesake of Walter Ferguson, who's on this Zoom right now. It's going to be about family. He was from Alabama, but he owned a business that went back and forth between Mexico and Mobile Bay, Alabama. And so the background of the story is going to be his story, but the conflict within the story, two sons, is going to be pure fiction. He only had one son, but in this book, he's going to have two sons. And I'm going to try to bring in salient topics. In this case, war. As I started the book, you know, we're in the middle of Afghanistan, Iraq, et cetera. I wanted to make a book about war. This next book, I'm going to bring in, because it takes place in Alabama in the early 1900s. I'm going to bring in racism and bring in a racial element into this book.
Mm. When do you think we'll get to read it?
Depends on the editors. I hope within 18 months.
Same editors?
Yeah, but the question on this book is if I'm going to, you know, it comes down to, can you get an agent that's going to publish, it's going to get a publisher that'll publish it. That's always the main battle. Writing, as my wife Mila said, writing seems to me the easy part, Jody. The hard part is getting it published. I said, you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much. Let's give Dr. Ferguson a big round of applause. And thank you very, very much. And I believe someone put on the chat your website, so if people wanted to follow your book reviews and your commentary about current events, it's there, and I highly recommend it. There's Lynn Perry to everyone. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Jody, Rose Betty. Thanks, McKinnon.